FOIA revealed that they were targeting a number of different political groups, including things like the Catholic Workers League and PETA and Greenpeace, rather than focusing, like you say, on actual terrorists. And that's the kind of activity that couldn't take place in the criminal justice system because you actually have to come and show your work at some point.
Yeah, but even then, I mean, we've seen, you can just go down the list, I think 2 in Virginia, 1 in New Jersey, 4 or 5 in New York, in Detroit, in Lodi, California, Miami 7. I mean, there's been nothing but bogus terrorism trials. Hell, they convicted Jose Padilla of knowing a guy who knew a guy who once sent money to Chechnya back when America was backing the Chechen Mujahideen against the Russians, for Christ's sake. An American jury, they don't, checking their work means nothing now anyway. Innocent people go to prison, never even mind Guantanamo or any of that madness, but on domestic terrorism charges all the time over nothing.
Right, and certainly the FBI's use of informants has been extremely problematic, and particularly since 9/11, and particularly in the cases that you mentioned. I'm not pretending that the system is perfect, but at least we know about those cases, and we can say things about those cases. Yeah. It's the ones that are hidden, people who lose their jobs, never know why, people whose bank accounts are closed, who never know why. And it's, this sort of secret ability of government to act that actually, starts to chill free speech, where people say, well, I don't want to go out to this protest because I know the FBI surveils these protests and it might, get the wrong idea about me. That sure, I oppose the war, but, I'm not a terrorist. And if I go, and show up at this public protest, it's not worth the trouble. So that's the type of thing where it really starts to harm our democracy entirely, and not to mention is extremely wasteful and ineffective, as the Washington Post Top Secret America series revealed clearly.
Right, it's just a big jobs program for millionaires and billionaires, and I guess people that make at least 6 figures, are at the low end.
Right, yeah. And that's a big part of the problem is that this thing has expanded, this surveillance apparatus has expanded so quickly that literally the people who are involved in it and who ostensibly run it don't even understand its scope. And, that the secrecy that covers that opens the door to all sorts of intentional misconduct and illegality, as well as just error and abuse.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure I want to belabor this point too much because I'm not sure if I really have a point, but it seems worth bringing up, I guess, that, the Peter Lance narrative in 1,000 Years for Revenge and his timeline and the story of Al-Qaeda in America from the time that they first got here in, I guess, right around 1989 or so, and then the assassination of Rabbi Kahane in New York and the First World Trade Center bombing, and then through all the rest of it, all the way through September 11th. The story he tells is of the FBI, and I think this includes the criminal division, routinely blowing each and every case. And the reason why is because they blew all of them. And so every time they blew a case and something horrible happened that they could have stopped, they had to cover up that fact. And in covering up that fact, they never followed the leads that they needed to follow in order to stop the next one. So, for example, they pretended that the assassination of Kahane was a one-man operation, when in fact it wasn't. And then, the World Trade Center that's kind of a complicated thing, but we all know about Imad Salem and the proposal to use an inert powder instead of a real bomb, that they blew that case. Then they had to cover that up. And it goes to Michael Scheuer's accusation that using police power to take care of these terrorism problems isn't good enough. His point being we got to have a war. So anyway, back to that question of the police power versus intelligence and special forces and whatever for dealing with the very small Al-Qaeda problem in the world. Because I want to prefer yours, but I want to give you a chance to convince me, basically.
Sure.
So. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Mike German. He was a special agent at the FBI for 16 years. Now he's at the ACLU. He's got an article here at the Campaign for Liberty called We Need Whistleblowers. Got that right. Okay, so the FBI criminal division covered up their mistakes Al-Qaeda attack after Al-Qaeda attack after Al-Qaeda attack. I think Lance makes the case they could have stopped the embassy bombings. They could have stopped the Cole bombing. The FBI could have even, if they had, and never mind even the first World Trade Center attack, if they had just, fessed up to their mistakes in the first place and followed all the leads where they went, and that they refused to do so. And I think, I one time mentioned the name John O'Neill to Michael Scheuer, and I thought he was going to have an aneurysm. He said, John O'Neill is why 9/11 happened. It's all his fault. The FBI screwed up everything. Every time we had good intelligence, they wanted to take it and make it secret before a grand jury or some nonsense. And there's a real conflict there. And so, I would prefer to have no government at all, really, but if I have to have, a war on terror or whatever, I'd much rather have the FBI agents fight it, even worldwide, like under the 90s model, than the war on terror that we have now. But I guess I need you to prove to me that could be effective.
I'm not here to defend the FBI. The FBI is woefully mismanaged and has been for some time. The historical cases you mentioned reflect some of that. But if you dig a little bit deeper, what you find is a large part of that was this separation of between the FBI's two houses, where if you look at the criminal prosecutions, you mentioned the Mayor Kahane assassination, that case was successfully prosecuted. But what happens is the way that the FBI managed those international terrorism investigations is once the criminal prosecution was over, it became an intelligence matter and went over to the other side of the house. So it was, again, that putting the information into the other side of the FBI left the criminal justice system with an inability, the criminal justice side of the FBI, with an inability to collect that information continuously, where they could have proceeded from one investigation to the other. Purely out of mismanagement by the FBI, they made up this idea of a wall. But the 9/11 Commission report was clear that it was a misunderstanding of the legal rules that created a wall, not an actual legal wall. But rather than, recognize what the real problem was, they simply expanded the intelligence side of it. And, with all due respect to Michael Scheuer, there were a lot of, the CIA and the military and NSA also had significant failures that led up to 9/11. So the idea that the CIA's record before or since has been perfect is highly misleading. And in fact, I would put the FBI's criminal justice prosecutions of terrorism up against anything that those other agencies have done. And I think the critical mistake was made was to put all the significant resources into the black ops and the military involvement, which of course, costs trillions of dollars and blood and treasure. I think if you ask the average American whether they feel safer than they did on September 10th, 2001, despite all this expense of blood and treasure, I think most of them would say no. So, we can't go back and relive the history, but I think if we had taken a criminal justice approach and used that money to instead build transparent and professional legal and law enforcement agencies within these other countries, we would be much further ahead because, again, this is a very small number of people that are involved in these international terrorism groups, and using a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer on them is actually more effective, because part of the problem with using a sledgehammer is goes back to a comment that Don Rumsfeld made early in the War on Terror, where he said, how do we know we're not creating more terrorists than we're capturing and killing? And that's, I think, the problem here 10 years out, where we see, people like the underpants bomber who, was only 15 years old on 9/11 and a high school student, and yet, for some reason has decided that it's worth sacrificing his life for this movement. And, of course, what stopped him wasn't the trillion-dollar national security surveillance system, but rather a passenger. So, what's mistaken in all this is that these other methodologies are not actually working and not making us safer.
Right. Well, it's worth pointing out that America had been bombing Yemen for 3 weeks straight leading up to that Christmas attack. People always want to get their cart and their oars in the wrong order, so I always like to just point that out. Not that you had deliberately left that out or anything. I just wanted to take that on there. So, listen, you heard the Foreign Legion song on the way in from the commercial there. FBI spying on us through our radio antennas. And I guess that's a little bit hyperbole, probably right, but I'm reading in the papers all the time that as long as my car's parked in the driveway instead of in the garage that I don't have, it's okay for a cop to put a GPS tracking device on my car? That's pretty close.
Oh, absolutely. And clearly the FBI's
this goes back to that sledgehammer thing. They decided that they would just destroy all our freedom so they won't hate us for our freedom anymore. And they turned the whole terror war against you and me here.
Exactly, and that's the huge part of this, surveillance methodology is by scooping up all the information, as we saw with the underpants bomber. It makes it harder to find those few pieces that are actually meaningful, not easier. And, one of the things that we've been doing here at the ACLU, we just issued a nationwide series of Freedom of Information Act requests because the FBI has started these domain management investigations under new authorities that they claimed through the Attorney General guidelines that were amended literally a month before President Obama came into office. And under this domain management authority, they according to their internal documents, are creating what they call geomaps of racial and ethnic communities inside the United States. So we're trying to get to the bottom of that and find out what it is they're actually collecting. And their internal documents say that they can collect things like the location of ethnic facilities and businesses and things like that. So, they've turned this super powerful spying mechanism internally against us, and that's a huge part of the problem.
You have any suspicions about what that's in preparation for or anything?
Well, in 2007, the LAPD announced a Muslim mapping program that was immediately shut down after the public outrage. So I think it was, basically along those same lines that they believe, crime, different types of crime problems come from different ethnic groups. So if we know where all those ethnic groups were, I mean, it's really a mind-boggling sort of theory behind this, but yes, it appears to be what they're doing. They're
mother
actually
of all fishing expeditions.
Right,
basically.
exactly. And there was a 2006 article that talked about them targeting Iranian immigrants in San Francisco, and you might have seen Jeff Stein of Congressional Quarterly wrote a piece about how they were using falafel sales to decide where the Middle Eastern community was, and the FBI denied it, but Jeff Stein stood by his story, and now this internal documentation by the FBI certainly seems to suggest that tracking ethnic businesses is appropriate.
I am so glad these people are in charge of keeping me safe and persecuting me. They're going to do a great job, at least at the second part, I'm sure. Is there like a law that forbids that or anything, or what? And now we're out of time. This whole ethnic mapping thing is very interesting to me. We'll have to follow up on this, I think.
Okay, I'd love to.
There's so many more abuses, and you make for a really great guest. You obviously have all the expertise in the world required to answer all the questions I got. And you wouldn't believe the police state section of news stories that I have to discuss here. So I hope we can do this again soon, Mike. I appreciate it.
Anytime. Just let me know.
Everybody, that's Mike German from the ACLU. Used to be an FBI agent. Now he's a good person.